All right. Good morning or afternoon, or whenever you're watching this U.S. history class. This will be your last set of notes for the week. Um, so I'm recording this on Wednesday, but Wednesday we're going to do a lot of campaign stuff with Mr. Lovelace. So you'll be doing that stuff. So you can do this Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whenever, just as long as it's due by Monday, and then hopefully I'll be back on Monday. So these are notes for over the weekend whenever you get a chance to do it. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at some of the carnage that was left after the Battle of Gettysburg, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Gettysburg Address. If the video will load.
The big question after every Civil War battle, what to do with the dead. Here at Gettysburg, 7,000 slain soldiers. A town, 2,500 civilians who were inundated with having to care with more than 20,000 wounded soldiers. Now, after every Civil War battle, the victor's responsibility to take care of the dead. Here at Gettysburg, Confederate Army fleeing toward Virginia, a Union Army in pursuit, a Union Army that did not have the time to be able to properly care for these dead, to give them what men on both sides refer to as a good death. The pits around me at the base of Culp's Hill, they were constructed in a hasty way. They were about 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, blankets tossed over the soldiers. To get to that central location, the burial details usually took a rope, tied it around the legs of the corpse. Then they dragged those bodies to that central location. Now, because this was done with such haste, just a little bit of dirt thrown over the graves, rain, wind, erosion, wild hogs running about would root into these graves, expose the bodies. It was truly a horrifying scene. Soldiers on both sides recognized this. They realized that when they left their dead comrades, that they in fact would not get that decent burial. It played upon them in great ways. Now, Abraham Lincoln, he came here on November 19th of 1863, and he, of course, wanted Americans to draw inspiration from this loss of life. He spoke of a new birth of freedom. But for the men on the ground, both Union and Confederate, they didn't see the future with such clarity. Their memories were of these pits around us, not just here at Gettysburg, but at other Civil War battlefields. It tried them. It played upon their emotions. And it reminded them that this war was a confusing mess, and that to find deeper meaning in it was extraordinarily difficult, as they always were haunted by the memories of leaving their comrades behind.
Okay, so you kind of get an idea of what was left over after all the battles kind of took place. So, the Gettysburg Address, it's one of the more famous um, speeches that Lincoln ever gave. It was done on November 19th, 1863, at the dedication for the Soldiers National Cemetery. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that you may have heard from a variety of different people about the Gettysburg Address. The majority of them are probably false. It's one of those deals where there's talk that he wrote the Gettysburg Address on the train from Washington, D.C. to Pennsylvania. That's not true. He didn't write it on a napkin or a brown paper sack or any of that type of stuff. He took his time writing it. It wasn't a very long speech. He wasn't doing it to make a long speech, but it was a very important speech. The other thing that's unique about the Gettysburg Address is that as they made the Gettysburg Address, there was a huge crowd there, and the crowd was not there to see Abraham Lincoln. The crowd was there to see a guy by the name of Edward Everett. Uh, he was a great orator at the time, and the other thing that you kind of got to remember, and it seems odd, I realize, but um, the entertainment of the day was going to listen to people's speeches. Plays and speeches were kind of the thing. So it would be similar to going to a concert, or a movie, if you would go there and watch this Edward Everett speak. He spoke for over 2 hours. He was the main speaker at the ceremony. Lincoln was just a quick little blurb at the end of the ceremony to dedicate the cemetery. Total of 271 words. The other thing that was interesting about the Gettysburg Address is people, when Lincoln gave the speech, the newspaper man and whoever else was there to see it commented how pale he looked and how shaken up he was over the enormous loss of life in Gettysburg, which he was, but also he was suffering from a case of smallpox. So that was one of the reasons why he looked so rough. So we'll watch a quick video and you get to hear the Gettysburg Address.
Fourscore and 7 years ago,
our fathers brought forth on this continent
a new nation, conceived in liberty,
and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war,
testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
We are met on a great battlefield of that war.
We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place
for those who here gave their lives that nation might live.
It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this.
But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate.
We cannot consecrate.
We cannot hallow this ground.
The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it.
Far above our poor power to add or detract.
The world will little note nor long remember what we say here.
But it can never forget what they did here.
It is for us, the living, rather,
to be dedicated here to the unfinished work
which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us.
That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause
for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain.
That this nation, under God,
shall have a new birth of freedom.
And that government of the people,
by the people, for the people,
shall not perish from the earth.
So there was a Gettysburg Address. Next, we'll talk about prisoners of war. So, along with casualties, remember we talked about casualties not only being dead and wounded, but also captured or soldiers that run away. But so there's about 400,000 Union and Confederate soldiers that were captured by enemy forces, and they became a prisoner of war. At the beginning of the war, prisoner exchanges were routinely negotiated. After they'd fight a battle, I'd have 500 of your guys, you'd have 1,000 of my guys, we'd cut a deal and we'd make an exchange, and then they go right back to fighting each other. As soon as the Emancipation Proclamation went through in January of 1863, it changed the way it kind of went, because there was no way that a Southern soldier was going to turn over a black prisoner to the Union. So it changed kind of the way it went, and it got a little bit harder. Thousands of men died being held in prison. The two worst for the Confederates were Andersonville, Georgia. A lot of Union soldiers died there. And then for the Union side, Elmira, New York, were the two worst prisons.
When
When war broke out in 1861, neither the United States or Confederate governments were prepared for long-term confinement of enemy soldiers. Initially, troops captured in the first 2 years of war were subject to battlefield paroles that returned them to their lines in a matter of weeks, if not days. In 1862, an agreement formalized exchange policies. The Dix-Hill Cartel created a system that exchanged soldiers in equal numbers who were of equal ranks. These exchange and parole policies were problematic from the very beginning. Accusations and confusion about the number of equivalent prisoners happened almost immediately. Commanders were well aware that battlefield paroles also benefited the army that needed troops the most. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation opened the doorway completely for black soldiers to enter the United States Army. It would be their presence in the ranks that altered the system of exchanges that summer. Confederate officials refused to exchange black prisoners on the grounds that a majority of them were escaped slaves, and thus property, who were ineligible for military service and could not be exchanged for a white soldier. The Union commanders stood their ground and would only exchange black soldiers and their white commanders as equal. Both the Union and Confederacy were now required to hold hundreds and later thousands of soldiers in captivity. Over 400,000 soldiers were held prisoners of war during the Civil War. Today we stand here at Andersonville, also known as Camp Sumter Military Prison. During the Civil War, it was one of the most famous prisons, as it continues to be today. However, it was by no means the only prison. Each government approached prison establishment in different ways, but both created prisons based on 3 key factors: defensibility, available resources, and transportation. In the North, prisons were shaped out of existing military fortifications like Fort Monroe or Fort Delaware. Some prisons were also built out of existing racetracks and fairgrounds, military training grounds, and other structures. One of the most surprising prisons during the Civil War is on a small place called Bellows Island in New York Harbor. An 11-point star fortification built during the War of 1812, it later became Fort Wood, a recruiting depot and prisoner of war camp for Confederate soldiers. A few decades later, the fort was filled in and became the base of the Statue of Liberty. In the South, many prisons were created in warehouses or open fields. Andersonville and Salisbury are both examples of open-air stockades. The South also worked to centralize prison populations in a small number of large prisons. For example, over 33,000 United States soldiers were held here at Andersonville in August of 1864. Other Southern prisons took the shape of warehouses or even islands, in the case of Belle Isle in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. After battle, prisoners were taken to the rear, under guard, moved to a train depot, and transported to the nearest prison camp, sometimes spending days on a train. Upon arrival, they would then be counted and placed inside the prison camp, meeting their new fate as prisoners of war. After accounting, guards were able to seize things that they wanted from prisoners. These items could be clothing, food, or money. Any item that a prisoner managed to smuggle inside a prison could aid their survival. Prisoners on both sides of the conflict faced similar hazards, such as contaminated drinking water, overcrowding, and diseases that passed between prisoners and prison camps. Diarrhea, dysentery, gangrene, scurvy, and smallpox were all conditions that plagued prisoners. The overcrowding in many of the stockade prisons led to a humanitarian disaster, as supplies were not always diverted to the prisoners, but rather pushed to the front lines. In both the North and the South, civilians attempted to aid prisoners as far as they were allowed. Some of the civilians even risked charges of treason to bring food and clothing to enemy prisoners. The Civil War prison system was successful in one major way. Escape was made virtually impossible for a majority of prisoners. There are some daring escape attempts by enlisted men and officers, but the remote locations, well-guarded perimeter, and hostile population ensured that for most prisoners, they would be recaptured, punished, and returned to captivity. However, slave populations were known to aid escaping Union soldiers to try to get to their lines, whether through food, directions, or shelter. By the end of the Civil War, almost 56,000 soldiers died in captivity, both governments failing to protect the lives of their men. Today, over 24 historic prison sites are managed by federal, state, and private organizations. Each site serves as a reminder of the cost of war and the fact that men fought for their lives, not only on the battlefield, but within the walls of a prison.
Last thing on the prisoners of war. As the war went on, the South was running out of supplies. We talked about Gettysburg. One of the reasons they went into Gettysburg or went north was to get food and shoes. So you can imagine if Robert E. Lee is taking his entire army north to get food and shoes, how well the prisoners of the Confederacy were treated. not a lot of food, not a lot of supplies. Just about every supply that the Confederacy could muster was sent to the front line. So it would have been fairly tough to be a prisoner of war in Andersonville, Georgia. Okay, we got two battles that we're going to talk about. The last two major battles in the Western Theater before Sherman's march to sea. So, we're going to start with the Battle of Chickamauga. Okay, it is Chickamauga and Chattanooga are located next to each other. So, Chattanooga is in Tennessee, Chickamauga is in Georgia. So what ended up happening here is Rosecrans was attacking from the north, and he attacked Chattanooga, and Braxton Bragg was the Confederate commander there, retreated out of Chattanooga without much of a fight, and tried to get and retreated. Retreated to Chickamauga. So as Bragg was retreating, Rosecrans split his army into two different divisions and tried to go around behind Bragg to cut off his retreat. And the plan was he was going to crush him. Before he could get around behind Bragg and cut off his retreat, Bragg got a whole bunch of reinforcements from Atlanta and Georgia. And as soon as he got his reinforcements, like A.P. Hill was one of the generals that in one of the divisions he got, as soon as A.P. Hill stepped off the train, Bragg put him into action and had him attack Rosecrans. The Confederate Army ran right through the Union Army because the Union Army is all spread out trying to get behind the Confederate Army. So Rosecrans gathered up all the army that he had left and retreated to Chattanooga. There was over 34,000 total casualties. At that point, it was the second highest casualty total, second only to Gettysburg. Okay, so the last slide for the week, and then we're done. After the Battle of Chickamauga, there was the Battle of Chattanooga. That is in the southeast corner of Tennessee. So after the retreat of the Union Army, it was besieged by the Confederates and almost surrendered. So the Union Army, when it went back to Chattanooga, was outnumbered and had limited supplies, and they couldn't really get any supplies in, and they couldn't really get the army out. And so they were under siege for about 21 days. And they were starting to run out of supplies. They were starting to become very nervous about the prospect of starvation, and it's as close as a Union Army got to surrendering throughout the entirety of the Civil War. Lincoln sent 20,000 men and supplies from Meade's army, who just got done fighting in Gettysburg. Not just got done, but who had just fought in Gettysburg and been victorious, and they hadn't fought a battle since July. So Lincoln sends 20,000 men and supplies. He also sends Ulysses S. Grant, and he made Grant the overall commander of the Western Theater. So Grant gets there, and his whole team that beat Vicksburg, had the siege at Vicksburg, shows up. So Sherman and all the boys, they show up, and Grant orders an attack on Lookout Mountain. So there's two things: there's Lookout Mountain and there's Missionary Ridge. And so they go up the mountain and they defeat the Confederates, and the Confederates retreat to Missionary Ridge. Got Gettysburg on my brain apparently. So the Confederates get up to Missionary Ridge and they await for an attack. Grant doesn't attack right away because he knows if he keeps going up the hill and attacking entrenched positions, he's going to be in trouble. And the climb up to Missionary Ridge is steep. It's almost straight up, and as Bragg looks at it, he doesn't really think that anybody would be crazy enough to attack in the middle of the Confederate line. So what he does is he takes the majority of his soldiers and puts them on his right and left flank. So Grant, whose main guy is William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant tells him to attack the left flank, and Sherman is stoned. He doesn't get anywhere because that's where the majority of Bragg's forces are. And so after Sherman is repulsed, Grant decides to order a very light attack in the middle because he doesn't want to have a whole bunch of his guys slaughtered. So he just sends about 10, 15,000 people right through the middle of the Union or the Confederate line. Well, Bragg didn't have very many people there, so what ended up happening is the Union soldiers took it. It surprised them as much as it did Bragg. So they broke through and they took the ridge. They pushed the Confederates back into Georgia. There was over 11,000 casualties during the Battle of Chattanooga. So we'll watch a couple of really quick videos on Chattanooga, and then we are done for the week.
Good evening. My name is Clyde Hedges, and I've recently written and published a novel, The Boys of Chattanooga. The Boys of Chattanooga concerns the battle fought for Chattanooga in November of 1863 during the American Civil War. I believe this is the most remarkable battle fought during this war, and I have 5 reasons I'd like to share with you why I think so. Number 1, it was the only time during the war that a Confederate army besieged a Union army. The Confederate Army of Tennessee surrounded the United States Army of the Cumberland, which was trapped in Chattanooga Valley for 2 months. Number 2, it was the only time during the war that a Union army starved and came close to surrendering. And believe me, if they had surrendered, the war might well have ended differently. And, we would have been a divided country. Number 3.
Okay, that's enough from him. And then one more quick.
Traveled a month-long siege of Chattanooga. After the Battle of Chickamauga, the Union Army of the Cumberland retreats to Chattanooga. Confederates under Braxton Bragg pursue and take position on the heights surrounding the city, presenting a formidable obstacle to the Union Army and preventing all but the tiniest trickle of supplies from entering the city. The situation remains unchanged for an entire month. So by the end of October 1863, Bragg's Confederates are no closer to destroying the army they had whipped a month earlier. And the Union Army of the Cumberland, now under General George Thomas, is stuck inside Chattanooga. And even though they have the will to fight, they lack the physical means to break out of the city. However, Chattanooga and the railroads that converge there are essential to the Union war effort, and Abraham Lincoln is ready to move heaven and earth to ensure that the city not only stays in Union hands, but serves as a base of operations for future offensives into the Confederate heartland. Union reinforcements moved to Chattanooga in the form of the Union Army of the Tennessee, the Victors of Vicksburg, under the command of William T. Sherman, and 4 divisions of the Army of the Potomac, fresh from their victory at Gettysburg, under the command of Joseph Hooker. But perhaps more importantly, Ulysses S. Grant has been promoted to command all of the Western armies of the United States. Grant himself will oversee the relief effort at Chattanooga. He arrives cold, wet, but ready to work. Now, before Grant can lift the siege, he must first bring supplies to the starving Army of the Cumberland. Fortunately, when he arrives, one of his generals, William F. Smith, has a plan to float boats down the Tennessee River to establish a bridgehead on the southern side and connect with the Army of the Potomac units that are arriving. The plan is nuts and rife with danger, but Grant is anxious to take action and greenlights the project. On the night of October 27, 1863, federal troops under the command of William Babcock Hazen float down the Tennessee River, establish a bridgehead at Brown's Ferry, and link up with Hooker's men the next morning. Bragg sees this and wants to stop the relief effort, but James Longstreet's half-hearted attempt to break the Union supply line at Wauhatchie is beaten back in the middle of the night of October 28th. In 3 days, Grant has already begun to unravel the month-long siege of Chattanooga, but Bragg and his generals are too busy arguing with one another to do anything about it. In the face of their inaction, Grant's army grows stronger, gets resupplied, and is ready to take the initiative. On November 23, 1863, Union troops seize high ground called Orchard Knob. The next morning, Hooker's men sweep the Confederates off of Lookout Mountain in a mythical engagement known as the Battle Above the Clouds. On November 25th, Union troops set their sights on Missionary Ridge, the last Confederate stronghold. Sherman will attack from the north, Hooker will sweep up from the south, and the Army of the Cumberland will make a demonstration against the base of Missionary Ridge. But these Cumberland men, who've been sitting besieged in Chattanooga for 2 months, have ideas of their own. They launch their own attack, not just a demonstration, but a full-fledged assault up the side of Missionary Ridge, sweeping the Confederates off in confusion. Grant's pursuit is stopped at Ringgold Gap on November 27th by a potent rearguard action led by Patrick Cleburne, but the damage has already been done. With Chattanooga firmly in Union hands and Grant's star on its way to its zenith, the stage is set for 1864, and the gateway to the South is wide open.
All right, that is Chickamauga and Chattanooga. See you Monday, hopefully.